Hello and welcome to this week's Talking Africa podcast, where we get behind the news from the continent. Our weekly podcast is brought to you by the Africa Report magazine, which you can always check out online at theafricareport.com. I'm Anne-Marie Besada. A report just released on April 6th shows the growing use of famine as a weapon of war in the ongoing fight in Ethiopia's Tigray region. Published by the U.S.-based World Peace Foundation, the report, called How Armed Conflict and Mass Atrocities Have Destroyed an Ethiopian Region's Economy and Food System and Are Threatening Famine, stresses how both Ethiopian and Eritrean elements in this Tigray war have single-handedly dismantled the region's economic and food system. Alex de Waal is the executive director of the foundation. He sits down with our Patrick Smith to discuss in detail the findings of this report.
Alex de Waal, you are the president of the World Peace Foundation, and you've just released this report on the food crisis in Tigray. This detailed report, 78 pages, amounts to what your research indicates are starvation crimes against the people of Tigray. There does seem to be increasing international concern about what's going on in Tigray. When we record this today on the 2nd of April, there's a statement by the G7 calling on the Ethiopian government to respond to their concerns about the violence committed against the Tigrayan nationals by both people from Eritrea and the forces from Ethiopia. And it does actually mention the concerns about deprivation of food and the risks of starvation. I wondered, first of all, your take on the G7 statement, how strong it is, and what more you would like to see from it, and whether it begins to start looking at the issue you've raised, which is this one of forced starvation, and how to end that and how to get some accountability for it.
The statement follows on from consistent calls from the United States, the European Union, and the United Nations and others for improved humanitarian access, for getting essential assistance to the people of Tigray. Now, the situation as it is today is that of the population of about 5.7 million people in Tigray, the UN estimates that about 4.5 million are in need of emergency assistance. And of those, only about 1 million, chiefly around major towns, are actually getting anything. The remainder are in urgent need of food, of medicine, of water. And that is the most immediate need. But if we expand our analysis just a little bit, we'll see that over the next 6 weeks to 2 months, it's also absolutely essential that the majority of the Tigrayan people who are smallholder farmers are able to cultivate, because the rains come in June. And in the month or so before the rains, it's important that they prepare the fields and plough them. Because if that doesn't happen, then there isn't going to be a harvest at the end of this year. The harvest is gathered in the October to December period. And the entirety of the population is going to be dependent on food assistance or other sources of income for an additional year. Now, in order for that to happen, you don't just need to get food and medicine. You actually need to stabilize the security situation so that farmers can plant. And many of them have had their oxen stolen or slaughtered. They don't have tools. They don't have seeds. They need medicine to stay in their villages. And laborers need to be able to move around freely. So we need a cessation of hostilities urgently. And another call that the G7 have made is for a cessation of hostilities and the withdrawal of Eritrean troops. And there's actually no sign of that happening. happening. To the contrary, what we are seeing is that the Ethio-Eritrean alliance, the coalition of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed and his federal forces and President Isaias Afwerki and his Eritrean forces, they're actually mobilizing more troops. They're sending more divisions to the front. They're shopping for arms. And if this results in yet another military offensive over the coming few weeks, then we're going to miss this critical window for planting and cultivation.
Last week, in fact, the Ethiopian government did two things. It admitted to the presence of Eritrean troops in Ethiopia, but it also promised that it would oversee the withdrawal of those troops. You're saying nothing has happened in that direction at all?
Nothing has happened. And in fact, what Abiy did was, first of all, he only admitted that they had crossed the border a short way. He didn't admit that actually the Eritreans are running the majority of the war, and their troops have penetrated throughout Tigray, in fact, are even crossing into the neighboring regions as well. And he didn't give a timetable for it. So one assumes that the conversations that have been going on between Addis and Asmara are, let us see if we can have one more offensive and finish the job. And then the withdrawal can happen, or then some other kind of reconfiguration, some sort of military fait accompli can be presented to the world. That may happen. Up to now, they haven't judged the military situation correctly, and the Tigrayans have resisted quite effectively.
And when you say they might be thinking about finishing the job, that is the total destruction of the TPLF and its armed force.
That appears to be the military goal. That is the stated military goal. In fact, they don't even recognize it as a war. They call it a law enforcement operation to bring the leadership of the TPLF to justice. It is actually a war. There are numerous divisions. There are thousands of casualties every month, and it's ongoing. But the particular concern that we have in this report is the particular type of violation of the laws of war, which is the starvation crimes, which is starts the most prominent, well-known starvation crime is destroying food. But if we look at the definition of a starvation crime in international law, it is actually destroying, removing, or rendering useless objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population. So that includes not just food, but also medicine, water and sanitation, maternal care for children, and in fact, all means of livelihood and sustenance. Now, one of the things about Tigray is that Tigray historically has been a food deficit area. The highlands of Tigray are stony, not very fertile. And in order for the population there to survive, they need sources of income other than farming. So they have migrated as casual laborers to fertile farms in the west of Tigray, in areas that have been taken over now by the Amhara regional forces. There were very productive sesame farms there. They've worked as artisanal miners. They have worked in industry and services. And one of the things that we have seen over the last few months is the systematic shutting down of all those employment and income-generating opportunities. So hundreds of thousands of Tigrayans have been expelled from those fertile areas of Western Tigray that have been taken over by the Amhara. And that also means that the seasonal laborers can no longer gain an income there. There are industries that have been developed over the last 30 years, employing at least 50,000 people. They have been all systematically ransacked and looted. So employment from that has come to an end. The hotel industry has been utterly destroyed. It was already in recession because of COVID. And so on. And every single element in the economy has been attacked. It has really not only set back the development and poverty reduction efforts of Tigray by 30 years, but probably even more than that. And one's inference is that actually the intention of the forces is precisely to do that. They haven't said it, but it would. The attacks on economic infrastructure and livelihoods are so widespread, so systematic. It does appear that they simply don't want Tigrayans to be able to stand on their own feet again.
And when you say it's systematic, so what the Ethiopians government calls a law enforcement operation, and what a lot of most other people say is a civil war. When that started last November, there was a lot of heavy fighting and so forth. Now, what you're saying is that since then, there's been some sort of teleguided strategy to destroy the regional economy, a deliberate move. So that requires not just military people, but sort of economic planners, a whole sort of group of plotters, if you like, in Addis Ababa to organize. You can't just, it's not just a military operation. It's actually very much guided and strategized.
It's systematic. I don't know if there is an economic rationale behind it. Essentially, it's all done by the armies and also the Amhara militia. And what we see is that virtually every village has been touched in one way or another. Something like 80% of the clinics and schools have been put out of action, ransacked. And the shops, houses, farms, industries, everything is just dismantled bit by bit. Whether it was centrally planned or not is hard to say. It is extraordinarily thorough. So that in the case of, let's say, the Almeida textile factory in the city of Adwa, which employed about 8,000 workers until a few months ago, the Eritrean forces took everything they could load onto trucks, was loaded on and taken away. And the rest was bombarded with mortars and artillery and burnt. We have reports, very well substantiated reports, and also videos have leaked out of units of troops going down the streets where there are small shops, breaking open every shop, taking everything that they can get their hands on, down to the little kiosks where shoeshine boys have their cloths and brushes and polish, and breaking those open one by one. We have reports again, multiple reports of soldiers, Eritrean and Ethiopian, going to villages, slaughtering large numbers of farm animals, especially oxen that are absolutely essential for ploughing. And they slaughter more than they can eat. And then they just carry on killing the animals as punishment, even down to the levels of, and I've heard this on several occasions, of soldiers crushing and killing newborn chicks under the soles of their feet. Down to that level of petty, relentless destruction.
You started your professional career some 3 decades ago, looking at the horrendous famines and instrumentalization of famine as a weapon of war in Sudan and Ethiopia, as then was. What differences do you see to what's happening today in Tigray, to what was going on in the 1980s in Ethiopia, where the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front was the predominant force confronting the Derg in Addis Ababa? I mean, are we looking at a sort of replay of history, or is it worse?
In some ways, it is a replay of history, and it is terrible. I mean, I'd never imagined that, having documented these war famines, the use of starvation as a weapon of war in the 1980s, that more than 30 years later, I would be doing the same thing, especially after peace came to Ethiopia. And whatever the failings of the EPRDF government in Addis Ababa, and there were many, especially on the democratic and human rights front, one of their tremendous successes, which was acknowledged internationally, was poverty reduction, drought relief, and a remarkably equitable program of lifting up the poorest Ethiopians from a state in which they were routinely exposed to hunger. So that the poverty headcount in Ethiopia halved during the 30 years of the EPRDF. And they brought in a whole range of measures, the flagship measure being the Productive Safety Net program, which in 2015, when Ethiopia was faced with a very, very major drought, the Ethiopian government, and supported by international donors, responded very rapidly and effectively, reaching more than 11 million people within a matter of a couple of months. And because of the rapidity of the response and the way it was designed to keep farmers on their farms, cultivating with their assets and livestock intact, it meant that there was a very rapid rebound after that drought. So what we see in Tigray today is particularly tragic because it is actually a systematic undoing, a reversal of all those decades of progress, not just in Tigray, but also, one would fear, for the rest of Ethiopia as well. And then if we compare the use of hunger as a weapon in the current war to the 1980s, there are many similarities, a lot of burning of crops, a lot of forced displacement, a lot of interruption of trade. But I have never documented anything quite as relentless and systematic as what we are seeing today. I think it is worse.
Yet we haven't seen so far, until your report comes out, I guess, the same sort of international horror at what's going on. Is that simply because people just don't know what's going on? We haven't got the information. It was the famed BBC account in the late 80s that changed consciousness, certainly in Europe, about what was going on. Is that what we need to see in Ethiopia now? Sort of a determined, onslaught of media reporting about this?
I think the Ethiopian government's restrictions on reporting by journalists who really can't go outside the major towns into the rural areas, and the restrictions on reporting by aid agencies. I mean, any aid worker who goes there is under strict instructions to say nothing. Those have been remarkably effective. And of course, it takes some months to reduce people to starvation. It doesn't happen overnight. So we know the trajectory on which Tigray is set at the moment, which is a trajectory towards famine. We don't know whether it has reached famine or not. Probably it hasn't, but certainly it will if current trends continue. And what is needed, for sure, is that type of media exposure and outrage that really brings about robust, determined international action. But of course, this is a peculiarly bad time for this type of action because aid budgets are under enormous pressure. The UK aid budget has essentially been cut in half. And there is an element of willful denial about what is known about the gravity of the crisis in Ethiopia. People in aid organizations simply don't want to have to face the reality that they have another demand on their already overstretched resources. And many internationals also want to cling to the belief that Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed is still a reformer, that there is a reform process to be put back on track. Though I think a war of this nature and the crackdown on the opposition, the suppression of media, the spreading violent discontent throughout Ethiopia surely should give the lie to that.
You said Tigray is in the process of heading for a famine, and it's difficult to work out how far along that road it's got and how much time there is to act decisively to stop it. You also say that the region has apparently been partitioned into 4 areas, it seems. I wondered if you could just explain what that process is and how the military campaign has affected where people live, and give us a little bit more detail on perhaps how much time there is left and on in this crisis before they hit famine?
Well, the westernmost district of Tigray, which was an area that before 1991 was part of Gondar province. This was before provinces were divided along ethnic lines, has been taken over now as part of the Amhara region, which was formed in 91. And that is the agriculturally richest part of Tigray. This is the place where the US government has said ethnic cleansing has taken place. And it does appear that the great majority of the Tigrayan population has been expelled from that area. And ironically, the food security indicators for that area are good. It's a productive area. But of course, the people who are benefiting from that food security are not the Tigrayans who were there 6 months ago. They are the people who the small number who remain, and the much larger number of Amhara settlers who seem to have come in. So that is one area of the sort of quadripartite partitioning. In the major towns where the Ethiopian National Defense Forces are present, there is a sort of modicum of control by the Ethiopian authorities. Though every report indicates a level of lawlessness, including lawlessness inflicted by those Ethiopian soldiers themselves. So rapes, theft, looting, killing at checkpoints, and so on. These are the areas that are receiving aid. And the humanitarian access is relatively good. And the hospitals are beginning to function again, and so on. In the northern part of Tigray, the Eritreans are the de facto occupiers. They are really, apparently under invitation from the government of Addis Ababa, they are controlling the northernmost rural areas, towns and roads and so on, and are administering the area, having essentially looted it of everything of value. And then the larger part of the Central Highlands, Central and Eastern Tigray, is a war zone. It's fiercely contested, with the Tigrayan Defense Forces militarily active, fighting ongoing. And as the principally Eritrean forces are on the offensive in these areas, as they move through, they are also destroying what they come across. A few weeks ago, they destroyed a mango orchard in central Tigray, which was indicative of a level of wanton destructiveness that went far beyond the needs of any military necessity. And even if soldiers are not schooled in the current laws of war, the cutting down of fruit trees is something that is prohibited by the oldest traditions of the laws of war in Torah, in the Quran, and so on.
Right. How does the rest of the country react to this? We've got the government, of course, has pushed back very strongly against these accusations of war crimes and brutal force being used against food-producing areas and so on. What about other regions that have their own issues with the government? I'm thinking of Oromo, Ogaden, etc. I mean, what sort of response has there been to news coming out of Tigray from them?
The Tigrayans were not popular in Ethiopia. And what Abiy has managed to do is maintain and, in fact, seriously exacerbate a level of anti-Tigrayan sentiment, especially in the major urban areas like Addis Ababa. So the war is not unpopular. There is a feeling that the war is justified. And of course, the news about what is really going on is actively suppressed, but it is still trickling out. How long Abiy can sustain this remains to be seen. He is facing a very major economic crisis exacerbated by the war. He's going to the Bretton Woods institutions in a week's time for the spring meetings in order to get a bailout. And is expecting a rough ride because they will not be happy at the idea that money that has been provided to Ethiopia over the years for development, it went into infrastructure and projects that have now been destroyed or stolen by that same development partner. So the economic crisis will worsen. Unrest is quite serious in parts of Oromia and Beni Shangul. But that said, there's still quite a constituency of support for Abiy, especially in Amhara region. Now, one of the bases, one of the arguments that is made popularly is that Tigrayans got rich at everybody else's expense. And it may be the case that some individual Tigrayans got rich, but if we look at the actual indicators for Tigray as a region in terms of poverty and income, it's right bang in the middle of all the other regions of Ethiopia. It is basically the same as Amhara and Oromia regions in terms of levels of poverty and also trends in poverty reduction. And certainly in terms of the coverage of these national schemes, etc., like the Productive Safety Net program, they covered the entire country very equitably. So this idea that Tigrayans were getting rich on the backs of everyone else is one of those myths that is being incited for political reasons by the government.
So, because in your report, you talk about effort and the various economic initiatives. You talk about social safety nets, but you also talk about targeted investments. You're saying that those sort of investments we saw under the EPRDF from 1991 up to 2018, there were similar levels of investment across all the regions, that Tigray didn't benefit disproportionately from those sort of programs.
Tigray started from a lower base. Back in 1991, it was the poorest region.
And the most war, I suppose.
Because of the history of war. So it had more to catch up, and it did catch up. But it didn't go ahead of other regions. And I think this is a key point. And in fact, as most of the mega investments that Ethiopia was spending its resources on in the last 10 years, such as the railway from Djibouti to Addis, the Renaissance Dam, are not in Tigray region. And the big industrial parks that were being developed in and around Addis Ababa, in the southern regions, in Awassa and so on, were benefiting those regions.
Are you surprised at the lack of discussion, pressure from countries in the region? I mean, initially, when this war started back in November, there were efforts by Sudan to get involved. There was efforts by individuals within senior people in the African Union to get involved. They were pushed back very quickly. It's rumbled on, and by all accounts, if what you're coming up with now in terms of the evidence of a looming famine, that would require more regional engagement, at least. Are you surprised we're not seeing that?
The African Union has dismally failed on the Ethiopia case, and the failure actually began a few years ago when Abiy and Isaias made their peace deal, the peace deal that won Abiy the Nobel Prize. And that is sort of emblematic of the failure, because there is a tendency in the West to see peace in Africa as the work of charismatic individuals, rather than the hard grind of developing norms, principles, and institutions for conflict resolution and peacemaking and so on. And the peace deal that the two signed was actually the OAU deal, Algiers deal, dating back to 2000. Now, the expectation of the Africans was that the two leaders would come to the African Union summit, which was held just 2 weeks later in Mauritania. They didn't. This was the first time that an Ethiopian leader ever had not personally attended an African continental summit. Instead, they went to Abu Dhabi and they signed a deal in Jeddah. And they kept the real content of that deal secret. And so that represented was the triumph of the transactional politics of the Arabian Peninsula over the norms and principles and institutions of the African Union, which, however flawed they may be, do demand that peacemakers have a shared plan for activities such as democratization, demobilization of their soldiers, implementing all the different provisions of a peace agreement. Now, what we know, of course, is that in the subsequent 2 years, on the Eritrean side, none of this happened. This was the opportunity for Eritrea to liberalize and demobilize, but it didn't. And clearly the reason why it didn't was that there was a plan for new military action against the shared enemy, which was Tigray. So already we saw a weakening of the African Union, and the African Union did not push back against that. And when the war broke out, the African Union leadership did not articulate those same norms and principles. It did not refer to the elements in the Constitutive Act, the refusal to tolerate war crimes, the insistence that peacemaking is not only an obligation on the neighbors, but there is an obligation on a country at war to accept peacemakers. This was all rebuffed, and the African Union essentially said nothing. The country that took a lead in trying to get through this problem was Sudan, and Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok, as the chairperson of the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, IGAD, tried to convene a summit, but in his opening statement, the chairperson of the African Union, Moussa Faki, instead of just making pleasantries, actually laid out an agenda, which was the agenda that the Ethiopians wanted, of not treating the conflict in Ethiopia as a matter for African concern. And this has meant that when the matter came to the UN Security Council, the 3 African countries there have not taken an active line, which has opened the door for Russia in particular to threaten to exercise its veto. So it's blocked action in that way. And what we would expect to see at the spring meetings of the Bretton Woods institutions next week is that the Africans will have a solid line of saying no new conditions on loans and assistance. And this is also backpedaling because 20 years ago, with the adoption of the new Partnership for Africa's Development, NEPAD, there was this mechanism of the African peer review mechanism. The idea being that African countries should review each other's performance in governance, in conflict resolution, etc., so that they would escape the trap of being in violation of basic principles and therefore having conditionality imposed upon them. By not having activated these mechanisms, the Africans actually are inviting a sharp new round of conditionality on international assistance to countries such as Ethiopia.
You and others have talked about the regional dimensions of this crisis, pushing some sort of realignment. I think in the last week or so, there's been a lot of talk about an alignment between Farmajo in Somalia, Isaias in Eritrea, and Abiy in Addis. Do you think that's going to happen? And if it does, how disruptive is that going to be to the sort of regional power system?
Well, Isaias definitely wants to put in place this sort of axis of autocracy. His idea, I think, is that he would be the linchpin. He has, as it were, got out of jail. He has escaped from sanctions, and he wants to have regional allies to counterbalance the countries that he cannot bully, such as Sudan and Kenya. The Abiy element, he seems to have that alliance secure for now, Abiy depends upon Isaias for his military capability, because the Ethiopian National Defense Force is so weakened these days, it will take a long time to reconstruct, even if they go on a major shopping spree for military equipment. And so he is reliant on Eritrea to keep Tigray down, if the Eritreans manage to do that. If Eritrea were to withdraw, Abiy would be faced with the reality that he needs to negotiate, and he does not want to face that. Farmajo in Somalia is in a more difficult position, well, in a different type of difficult position, because he has stayed on, even though his term has expired, and most of the Somalis, the federal member states, are pushing back against that. The international community has been irresolute on this. They have not taken a clear line. And so Farmajo is still hanging on. And clearly, if Isaias has his way, then the special forces that the special forces of Somalia that Eritrea has been training will be used as a sort of special enforcement force in Mogadishu and perhaps elsewhere in Somalia, and would plunge Somalia into a new round of violence. And obviously, this is an issue on which those international players who are very invested in Somalia are pushing back very strongly.
Does Abiy face threats within his own security system? I mean, first of all, how solid is the army behind this war in Tigray? And secondly, what about the wider population? As news comes out about the growing influence of Eritrea on Ethiopian politics and economy, isn't there a risk of some sort of nationalist backlash and saying, what the hell, we went to war with this country and now they're running things? Is that a danger coming up?
I think there is certainly going to be discontent and a backlash, and the Ethiopian army is not happy about the situation in which it finds itself, and the prospect that the Eritrean war effort, and indeed the Eritrean economy, will essentially be financed by resources transferred from Ethiopia. That is not going to go down very well in Ethiopia either, especially if the economic situation continues to deteriorate, and especially if the Eritreans are deployed more widely in the country, for example, against the Oromo Liberation Army and possibly even elsewhere. It's a very, very troubling scenario.
We've got a few minutes left. I wanted to get to a couple of other questions. First of all, you spoke at the beginning about why forced starvation has become this critical issue on human rights and the law of war crimes. I wondered if you could explain, I mean, how that comes under the various statutes, like the Rome Statute, this denial of food to populations, and why that would apply in the Tigray situation.
The legal situation with regard to prohibition of starvation is quite complicated, because there are different sources of law. There's human rights law, there's the Geneva Conventions, there's international criminal law formulated in the Rome Statute, there's the Genocide Convention, and none of these have really ever been tested in court. So it has not been a fashionable issue. So that, unlike, for example, 20 years ago, there hadn't been prosecutions for rape as a weapon of war, but due to the activism of gender rights coalition activists, this was put on the agenda, and we saw some prosecutions, and now rape and sexual and gender-based violence are high on the agenda and are exposed. The starvation crimes issue has been moving up the agenda, and the two things that have really happened in the last couple of years are, number one, is the UN Security Council passed a resolution 2417 in May of 2018, which highlighted the way in which armed conflict creates hunger and starvation may be a war crime. In the following year, in 2019, there was an amendment passed to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, which outlawed starvation as a war crime in non-international armed conflicts. For some reason, it had only been outlawed in international armed conflicts up to then. But the key thing is it is now in the political consciousness. What we used to see in the past was whenever there was a famine of this type, the aid agencies that were operational didn't want to speak about the causes, and they didn't want to speak about the causes of suffering because they knew if they spoke out about atrocities, their own safety would be endangered and they might even be expelled from the country as well. So they kept quiet about it and they preferred to talk about natural causes like drought or locusts or something. Attention has now shifted. We know that in Syria, we know that in Yemen, starvation has been a weapon of war, and now we see it again here. And I think this agenda is now reaching the top table, as it were, the G7, the Bretton Woods institutions, and indeed the UN Security Council, although, as I mentioned, it's not making much progress there.
You talk at the end of the report, you talk about the possible remedies for what is going on and the threat of worse to come. Could you spell out how you think those could play out, both within countries in the region and the wider global system?
Well, what I fear is that if there isn't an immediate humanitarian response in the next few weeks, then this situation is going to get a lot worse over the next year. And there's going to be a huge drain on budgets. And it's also going to orient international politics, because when a famine of this scale, this potential scale, begins to occur, it becomes a driving force in a lot of international engagement. And it will be inescapable for Ethiopia and Eritrea to confront this reality. What are the remedies? The immediate remedy is stop the war. Cessation of hostilities is the single most important thing in order to get assistance there, in order for farmers to be able to plant. Then looking ahead, there are a number of legal avenues that can be followed. I know that the lawyers and human rights activists will be interested in seeing what opportunities there might be for investigating and prosecuting starvation crimes. There's also a very interesting agenda here over restitution and reparation, because there are a lot of material assets that have been destroyed or stolen, so that private investors, for example, may be bringing cases for compensation, but also international aid donors. So that, for example, the UK taxpayer paid for a lot of the water supply systems in Tigrayan cities like Mekelle and Adigrat. That has been destroyed or stolen by the so-called development partner. Now, how is the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office going to respond to the fact that an asset paid for in part by the British taxpayer has been destroyed, and a bill is now coming? Is the FCDO going to say, "Oh, that's all right, we will rebuild it," or "We will let it lie destroyed"? Or are they going to say, "Well, actually, it's not our responsibility to rebuild it, but we will use what leverage we have, including financial leverage, to make sure it is rebuilt"?
We've got these investigations. There's a joint investigation by the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and the UNHCR into the reports we've seen flooding out over the last few weeks of war crimes, massacres, and so on. Is it possible that your concerns about starvation crimes could be added to this investigation, or will there have to be a very specific, separate investigation? How are we going to get to the truth of what's really going on, do you think?
Starvation crimes are war crimes and crimes against humanity. So they fall within the remit of the investigation, which is by the UN and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission
Right.
as currently constituted. They would need additional resources and expertise in order properly to investigate starvation crimes, but there is no reason why they should not acquire that.
Right. Well, thanks very much for your time, Alex. Could you tell our listeners how to get hold of this report and any of the events that are coming up to put it out in the public domain?
The report is on our website, worldpeacefoundation.org, and that will also have links to other events and publications related to this topic.
That's all for this week. I hope you enjoyed today's podcast, and a special thank you to our guest, Alex de Waal. You can always catch our previous episodes and all our features online at theafricareport.com. If you enjoy this podcast, do remember to rate and review us on your favorite platform. For the Africa Report, this is Anne-Marie Basada. Thanks for listening.